Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Hi, Dave.
Oh,
How are you?
well, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. It's good to connect with you.
Yes.
Yes.
Lord willing, someday in person.
Yes. Yeah. I know we've emailed many times, but it's good to finally connect with you. And thank you so much for being willing to do this. I was looking over your bio, Dave, and I noticed that you list multicultural psychology as one of the classes that you teach. And I teach cross-cultural psych at SPU. And so I imagine there might be really strong connecting points there in our experiences. I'm curious, how do you go about integrating Christian faith into a class like multicultural psychology? Is there an example that you can give, such as an approach or an assignment that you integrate into the class?
Yeah, great question. I think over the years of teaching this class, I've become more and more appreciative and aware of tying and locating multicultural and diversity and multicultural psychology and locating that within the sphere of Christian formation and
Mm.
discipleship, because Christian formation it's always embodied.
Mm.
Sure, certainly there's a lot that we can talk about theoretically or conceptually, but when we are formed, more and more into the likeness of Christ, we're formed as the people that we are, and that includes all the different dimensions of our identity, gender, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. That is what God's working with as he's forming that into his likeness. A lot of times people talk about, or at least some Christian communities might talk about multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion as something that is outside of the faith, or even from some perspectives as antithetical to the faith. Like, it's not Christian, it's, Marxist, or it's something else. And I feel like certainly there's, some fair critiques that can be made. And at the same time, I feel like it's a profound misunderstanding of both what, diversity and multiculturalism is about. And it's also, I believe, a profound misunderstanding of what the Christian faith is actually modeling and for us. So to that end, one of the assignments that I really enjoy assigning and talking through with students in my multicultural class is I ask all our students to complete a cultural genogram. And as you know, a cultural genogram is kind of it's like a family tree, but it's a lot more extensive. It's not just listing the people, but also, marking patterns of, relationships and conflicts and mental health struggles and divorce and marriage. And it's really helpful because I think it just illustrates how everyone has a cultural context as well as an intergenerational family context as well. I think a lot of times people taking this class, some people will think like, oh, because I'm not a person of color, I don't have a culture. Of course, I can address that in a theoretical way, but I think it's more effective oftentimes to actually demonstrate it by asking them to do something like this and for them to explore their own kind of cultural and intergenerational heritage.
I got excited when you said genogram because I also assigned that in my cross-cultural
Oh,
psych class.
wonderful.
And I think it's encouraging for me as a teacher to hear another person say that they utilize that pedagogical tool. Because as you know, and as you alluded to, sometimes there's pushback because sometimes students might say something like, oh, I don't have a culture, or I really don't want to explore this part of my identity. And so thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you that the genogram is a wonderful tool to not only see the intergenerational patterns, but also see how complicated families are, right? And
Yeah.
also how so many identities intersect to impact things like beliefs about diversity, beliefs about, various dimensions of diversity. So thank you for sharing that example.
And I would just add a short point, which is, a lot of times you can get a picture of somebody's calling into the field of psychology through their cultural genogram, where you can see patterns of mental health struggles or patterns of pain that a lot of family members have gone through. And that really has shaped the context for their interest in learning how to heal some of these things. It also paints a beautiful picture of resilience and vocation calling as well.
That's right. Yeah. So it's beneficial for the student, but also ultimately beneficial for the student in the sense that they will not only have a better understanding of themselves, but also use it for their clients, right? As a tool within the clinical setting. I'm curious now, this is for my selfish reasons, but when you assign the assignment, the genogram assignment, how far do you require the students to go? Meaning, how many generations do you require them to include?
So, we do give a guideline, aspirational guideline, and several students aren't able to do this, and that's okay. But we ask for at least 3 generations. But if they can go further than that, that would be wonderful. Many of our students are adopted, and they can only trace one. And that is important and significant as well. That's, grist for the mill.
Yeah, to be able to reflect on that, right? I require 3 generations. And sometimes students want to do more. Other times they struggle with even 1 generation. And so I encourage students then to reflect on why that might be. I also have students talk about how traumatic it is for them to talk to family
Yes,
members to get the information required for the genogram. So that itself is also a very meaningful conversation.
absolutely. I see that pattern very commonly.
You touched upon this already, but as you know, we live in an era where there's so much distrust of Christianity, especially when it connects to DEI topics. And I'm curious how you counter that in your teaching and in your scholarship. I know, again, you talked about it, but could you elaborate a little bit more? When students come in with such skepticism of how Christian faith can inform DEI understanding, how do you approach that?
The first place that I start, and a lot of times when I do this, it can be controversial and can invite further conversation as well, is I validate that distrust. And unfortunately, as someone who's taught in Christian higher education, I think it's a good starting point to say that a lot of that distrust is warranted. Unfortunately, many of our colleagues and friends and brothers and sisters, most of whom probably have very good intentions, but in reality, oftentimes have a very shallow or lack an understanding of how some of these dynamics play out, not just individually, but systemically. And, you know, oftentimes when I see the faith brought into this conversation about DEI, really more in a way of using the faith to minimize, the need for diversity, to gloss over other people's, hurt in this area, to endorse kind of colorblind ideologies, like, well, Jesus, loves all the children, that's true, but then they don't also understand that these colorblind ideologies actually are very harmful when
Mhm.
reality is that even though we all are created in the image of God and have that same, value and intrinsic worth, the reality is that people don't treat us the same way. Even in my work with clients, many of whom have grown up in Christian schools, unfortunately, some of the most hurtful contexts where racism is played out is actually in Christian communities. And so I start with the validation, and then I talk about the dissonance between the real and the ideal. Certainly from the Christian faith, there's this ideal that we're all created in the image of God, and that's true and good. But I think what we miss is the other side of the tension of, even though we have this ideal, doesn't get played out in reality,
Mhm. Mhm.
and the denial of that, unfortunately, is, very much tied to many Christians that I find. And, part of perhaps a way forward, I believe, is that there really needs to be a reimagining, a reclaiming of Christian spirituality, of Christian virtue, of Christian formation, of what it means to be spiritually mature, and, not trying to push an agenda of like, oh, how do we, force a DEI lens, through these constructs, but rather to embrace and acknowledge and cultivate how our faith is full of implications on intercultural dynamics. For example, our relationship with God is fundamentally intercultural. So, if we aren't able to be in close relationship with someone that looks or thinks or acts different than me, what hope do I have to actually have a close relationship with God who's transcendent, And there's a long history of our faith of being aligned with the marginalized. The doctrine of the incarnation is about suffering with being present to the suffering with others and suffering with them. And it feels like whenever Christians deny DEI related material and values, we really fundamentally go against the grain of our own religion and our faith teaches what God himself modeled.
So many important things you're highlighting there, Dave. When you talk about the ideal versus what is reality, right? It reminds me of how I frame it to my students, which is the difference between the way things are and way things ought to be, right? And how when we say things like, oh, we're all part of the human race, that's the end of the story. Maybe that's emphasizing the way things ought to be and not way things are, which is that there's pain, there's marginalization, there's microaggressions that we cannot ignore. So I really appreciate that framework that you presented. When I teach, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this as well, but on the first day of my class, and these are undergrad students, I give a survey, and part of that survey includes a question about how important is faith integration in this class. And this is cross-cultural psych. And
Okay.
over the years, I've noticed that more and more students indicate not at all important or moderately important, right? So initially the skew was the other way, where more students were wanting faith integration into the class, but now there are some, but not many want explicit faith integration. And I wonder, again, if part of that is because they are so disillusioned by sort of the lack of meaningful engagement of DEI topics by Christian churches. And that's been their experience. And so coming in, they think that it should not connect to their faith, or DEI topics should not be viewed from a Christian perspective. I still integrate faith, right? And I still try to find a way to show them that, hey, there is a really good way, or at least a meaningful way to look at everything from a faith perspective, right? But I think students do come in with a certain skepticism about DEI integration.
And, I think part of it is that there just aren't that many integrative resources out there. I remember putting together my syllabus for the class and trying to look for stuff. And there's just a profound lack of that. And we'll talk about this more later of locations and, to change that in my editorship of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. And, perhaps Lord willing, one day it'd be really fun for the two of us to write a paper that maybe that speaks into this more directly as well. But
Yeah.
as you said, I think it hasn't been modeled in churches, and I think largely it hasn't really been modeled in that academic world either among Christian scholars and psychologists.
Listen. Yeah.
So it might be up to us and others to make this different.
To that point, and I'm skipping a couple of questions here, I agree with you that there might not be many books out there that I rely on to sort of guide the integration of DEI topics with faith topics. But what are some, in your opinion, good ways to do faith integration in teaching, especially in psychology, and then not so effective ways? So, for example, sometimes I default to putting in a few Bible verses to illustrate interdependent self-construal,
Oh,
or
yeah.
what else? How we are to be connected to one another, but also distinct from one another. And so I find that the sprinkling in of Bible verses is not as effective. And so I'm curious if you have any effective ways that you found where faith integration was done well.
Yeah. Certainly Bible verses it's a good start. My opinion on this is that there is this larger issue with theological scholarship or even theological education. Most of what we teach in theology, like, systematic theology, for example, it's not embodied. So take systematic theology, for example, it's all conceptual for the most part and theoretical and systematic. So, and what systematic theology seeks to do is it takes this person of God, then it kind of, isolates specific characteristics of God, kind of like we're dissecting someone. And then we're studying theoretically every single characteristic and, dimension of God separately in isolation, and it's possible for us to be very, very trained in theology. And at the end of the day, not really know God. We know about God, but we miss the gestalt of who he is as a person, because we just focus on theory and it's not embodied. So my theological degree is in Regent College, Vancouver, British Columbia, so not too far. And it was spiritual theology. One of the things I appreciated about Regent College's, approach to spiritual theology is that it was an embodied theology. It's a theology of lived experience. That's, very much placed at the center, just experiences, spiritual experiences, so on and so forth. One of my starting points when I teach faith integration, especially on this area, is that because diversity is embodied, it's theoretical, our theology also needs to be embodied. So I also teach a course on trauma.
Mm.
And one of my favorite definitions of a trauma is from a Stollerow. He says that, trauma is what happens when intense emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held and expressed, you know. And then I ask the question, can your theology hold your pain? And continuing, can your theology hold the pain of your racial trauma? And most of the time, our answer to those questions is no and no. And, that is also a need for change in
Mhm.
the logical world as well. I recently did a trauma and spiritual formation training with theological educators in Ukraine, soon after the war in Ukraine broke out. And, their buildings and their schools are destroyed, and a lot of people have lost loved ones. It's, horrible situation there. And what they were telling me is, Dave, theological education has to be completely different when we start over again, because nothing we learned actually helps or is relevant to anything we're going through, right?
Mm.
So not to say that theology is not useful,
Right.
but, I think if all the theology we know cannot hold our pain,
Mhm.
it does not reflect the God in the Bible who was incarnate and came to suffer with us and can relate to every form of temptation that we have and yet was without sin.
Yeah. No, I love that question you asked about, can our theology hold the trauma of racial trauma, right? Can our theology speak to the effects of racism and really lament that and also offer a solution, right? I think about my own Christian communities as well and how we would answer that question. And it's very sobering to think about. Wow. So you have such a strong theological background. I really appreciate that. I'm also envious of folks who are in psychology, but also able to speak so profoundly in the area of theology. How has that helped you in your teaching of psychology students? What are some ways where your theology and your sort of deep understanding of theology impact your teaching of psychology?
Like some lectures will be more theologically based and will be led out of a more in-depth study of, and then relating it to psychology afterwards. Um, I think, especially in my trauma class, for example, we actually spend multiple weeks talking about theodicy, the theological understandings of the problem of evil. And some of the reasons why we do this is because, whether or not we know it, when we work with highly religious clients, like Christian clients,
Mm-hmm.
the conversation oftentimes naturally veers into the theological, especially when it comes to trauma and pain and suffering. Oftentimes a first initial question is, well, why did God allow this to happen? Yeah. And, there's also different kinds of meaning making structures that people learn at church. Things like, God ordained this for your good. There's this higher purpose. There's this lesson that he wants you to learn. You're going to come stronger at the end. And all of that's true, though I do feel like it oftentimes is oversimplified and can oftentimes create more problems than good. There's many different kinds of pain and suffering. There's the kind that is really based on, situations where we, if we give it more time, we will get a better sense of the purpose of it, and maybe there is going to be a higher good and it's very evident,
Mm-hmm.
if we give it time. But there's also lots of forms of hurt and pain and suffering and loss that it doesn't get redeemed on the side of heaven. Perhaps certainly there's a redemption when we see Jesus face to face in the end times, but on this side of heaven, anyone who's a mental health professional, we've heard plenty of stories of people who've suffered and then they pass away, and that's the end of the story. When you talk to children who have lost their parents prematurely,
Hmm.
I don't know if any of them would trade any kind of lesson or good for that.
Right. Hmm.
It doesn't always fit.
Yeah.
And I think when Christian communities only have those few explanations to hold on to and they try to make everything fit them, it can really do quite a lot of damage for those of us whose lives and narratives don't fit those trajectories. And I would actually say most of us, our lives don't fit that, at least not yet until Jesus returns. But another common theme, and which is not just a psychological concern, but a theological concern, is the just world hypothesis. And this has a lot of implications, not just on trauma, but on diversity as well. This idea that, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And a lot of times we'll reverse engineer that. So if someone experiences a bad situation, then they'll kind of reason to themselves that, okay, that must mean that I'm a bad person or I did something, and certainly that might be, a contributor in some situations, but oftentimes Christians have their faith is nothing more than just a spiritualized just world hypothesis. And that's actually not our Christian faith. It's premised on Jesus Christ who died on the cross, even though he had no sin. That's not just world, And I think DEI highlights how, very potently one facet, one dimension, one way in which the world is not just, and I think, the problem that I see is that people try to use Christian theology to argue that the world is just. And perhaps it might be in some places, but it is really out of touch with a lot of the experiences of people who are marginalized.
Yeah. Mhm.
And then it situates the faith into the position and the voice of the oppressor, which is completely antithetical to what the faith has always been.
Yeah, that's well put. That the just world hypothesis invalidates or minimizes the role of systemic issues and the experiences of those who are marginalized. Right? That, oh, if you are not doing well, it must mean that you individually must have done something wrong, right? Instead of also seeing the complexities of the structural factors that are contributing to them. Yeah.
Right. Speaking over in the oversimplified way, there's like a whole approach to Christian counseling, methodic counseling that is largely premised on that kind of foundation.
I wanted to also talk about how we bring our own identities into the classroom. And as a person of color, sometimes I find that teaching cross-cultural psychology feels personal. It's very personal. And compared to, say, teaching research methods. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts about your experiences in teaching multicultural or something similar where the content felt much more personal compared to other
Yeah.
classes. And if you feel comfortable, how you handle maybe some tensions that arose because of how personal things are.
I think, teaching a class like this, especially as a person of color, it's hard, it's impossible for this not to be personal, or not to bring about and, trigger memories of previous racially tinged experiences and hurts, some of which might be historical and some of which might actually still be ongoing, And, and we have a choice and an opportunity to be very vulnerable and to share this with students. And I think positive side of being vulnerable is that it creates the possibility of people becoming closer to each other, being in touch with their own experiences as well. And it's a really powerful teaching tool because it's not something that you can argue theoretically. It's like you're someone sharing their story. And on the other hand, because you are putting yourself in a vulnerable position, it does introduce some really, confusing at times and paradoxical power dynamics where, you're the professor, so you hold power and you evaluate students. And at the same time, you're also a person of color, where you're the recipient of a lot of these things. And there are going to be students in the majority culture that don't understand. And, some might be defensive, some might simply just be, they haven't thought about this before and they ask questions that might come across as kind of hurtful and invalidating. And that's something that we need to be realistic about and prepare for.
Mhm.
We have to be able to absorb that, and know our own limitations, so in a vulnerable state and I'm stressed out for other parts of my life, conversations like this, I might not have as much capacity for them. So that's one of the reasons why, these multicultural diversity classes are high burnout classes. And one way that has been helpful is when I've taught it, it's usually been co-taught. It's nice to have someone else, to kind of support each other and kind of balance each other out.
Mhm.
But at the bottom, at least from my own personal values, I feel like there's no way for it not to be personal. And one of the gifts that you can give to students is to allow how personal it is to allow that vulnerability to be a gift to the students so that they can perhaps hear something that they normally wouldn't have heard or
Yeah.
learned.
I think that vulnerability, modeling that is really important. And whenever students are able to get to a similar place where they are vulnerable and they struggle out loud with some of the questions that you have, I find that really rewarding. For me, I really feel passionate about teaching cross-cultural psychology. This is my area, but also because it's so personal, I feel like sometimes I struggle because I'm always seen as, oh, that person or Paul can teach that topic, right? Or that class. And
Mhm.
so this balance between, on one hand, having training in this area, but on the other hand, also not wanting to be stereotyped into a certain role. I think that's something that continues to come up for me.
Yeah, me too. I
Mhm.
don't know if I have a very good resolution to that tension. I can definitely say that I'm living it and navigating it with you.
Yeah. Yeah. These are really good conversations about teaching, but I also want to ask you about research because I know that
Yeah.
you serve as the editor of Journal of Psychology and Theology, which I find to be a really good outlet for my work. And I know that previously, if I remember correctly, you also served as associate editor.
Mhm.
And so many years in serving as either associate editor or editor of this journal. I'm
Mhm.
curious what's rewarding about this role, especially in light of the fact that the journal is explicitly Christian. And then what is challenging about the role of being an editor of a journal like this?
I think some of the challenges is that, our readership, unfortunately, some of which, they have been sucked into a lot of polarization in American Christianity. We do feel the pressures of, people on both sides wanting the journal to just represent their perspective.
Wow.
And we are very clear and very adamant about, not doing that. And we want this to be a context where multiple perspectives can be shared, where we can illustrate that the Christian community and Christian thought is not monolithic.
Right.
It's very, diverse. And I think that's a fundamental principle that, in group diversity, is usually more than between group diversity. I think that's true even within Christian communities as well. So we will publish stuff that, pushes the boundaries depending on, what perspective people take. And I think one of the greatest privileges is that for me as an editor of JPT for a number of years, is that traditionally the major voices that have shaped and spoken, created this field of psychology, they're mostly white and mostly male. And, I don't think there's a problem with, white men. I think it's just, perhaps that was our starting point. And I think it's a huge privilege for me to be able to, of course, not erase that,
Hmm.
but and rather expand the center so that there are more voices that can share and shape what it means to integrate psychology with the Christian faith, what it
Hmm.
actually looks like, how it's understood, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I've definitely seen that sort of expansion in the recent years. And I think you deserve a lot of that credit, right? And so thank you for doing that good work. And this is from my understanding, but also for other scholars who are interested in Christian outlets. How
Yeah.
would you say JPT is different in its focus compared to other similar journals? For example, there's psychology and Christianity, right, as another potential outlet for a similar type of work. I think that's the main one that I can think of. But how would you say that JPT distinguishes itself from other Christian social sciences outlets? Hmm.
I think that too, and I hope I don't come across as defensive or elitist when I say this, but the two major flagship journals in, the integration of psychology and theology are, Journal of Psychology and Theology and Journal of Psychology and Christianity. We are the two kind of original flagship journals. JPC is tied to, the CAPS conference and the CAPS community, and JPT is more of the standalone. I think we were the original. We were created first. But, for the most part, the two journals do publish quite a lot of similar content, and we publish a lot of the same authors. And I think over the years, I think JPT, we've been on a multi-year journey of moving towards, and I'm not saying JPC hasn't done this, but I think all I can share about is our process. We're really trying to model a kind of Christian scholarship that is about bridge building
Mm.
and bridge building in multiple ways.
Mhm.
I think one way, that previous conversation we just had about diversity, incorporating, additional voices, also international voices as well. I think that's one form of bridge building. But another direction we've been hoping to take is bridge building with the non-religious, academic, literature as
Yeah.
well. So I feel like if, there are ways for non-religious scholars to kind of naturally find and cite some of our work,
Mhm.
that's also another goal and mission of the journal, to build bridges between our faith community with scholarly communities outside of our religious context. So to that end, we've actually been moving more towards empirical research, and trying to up the ante in terms of the quality of our empirical work for it to be data driven or at
Mhm.
least data informed. Fortunately, in the last several decades, I mean, there's just been this burgeoning of empirical research on the psychology of religion and spirituality. So kind of riding that wave and, giving people freedom to do more explicitly theological work, especially as they make sense and discuss some of these empirical findings. So really it's kind of more pushing towards the diversity and also moving more towards like an empirical basis so that we have more common ground to share with the rest of the literature in our, the field of psychology.
Yeah, that really helps. And at the same time, from a journal like Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, what would be different about JPT would be the content would still be focused on Christian faith. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right.
When you look at a manuscript submission, how do you determine that it has an appropriate Christian focus for the journal?
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, just like going through a Christian psychology integration program, anyways, those kinds of programs are more difficult than APA programs, that are non-religious, because on top of every class you would normally take in an
Yeah.
APA accredited program, you have to take all these units of theology and integration and figure out how that all mixes together. I didn't have to do that when I went to a secular university, So in a similar way, in some ways, submitting a journal article or writing a journal article for JPT also adds that additional layer of complexity where we're evaluating it not just on the empirical research methodology and whether it's sufficiently rigorous or
Mhm.
uh, sound, but also in the depth of its theological discussion and implications, the framing of it, the interpretation of the findings. And personally, for me, I think we've touched on this theme several times earlier today. For me, there's also a practical and applied element. So theology's the kind of theology I really am passionate about is the kind of theology that can hold our pain, that can actually make a difference in the world. I also ask questions like, well, does the church need to hear this? Does our society need to hear this? Do Christians need to hear this? And that's another kind of evaluatory kind of question I think to myself as I read through various submissions into our journal.
That's really helpful. Yeah. That practicality in application. I mean, in a counseling journal, you would look for counseling and training applications, right? Similarly, in a journal like this, what kinds of implications might the findings have for church leaders? Right? It's not a question that I wrote down ahead of time, but as I'm listening to you, I became curious. Is there like a special issue or an area that you want to stretch the journal in that you have not yet done so? Like something that you're just itching to do with the journal? Yeah.
So one is, one special issue or the series of two special issues is actually about to come out later this year. It's our first ever special issue on peace, justice, and diversity, from an integration perspective. Nothing like this has ever been done before. I think in any integration journal, and going to be a good mixture of empirical research as well as theoretical research. So I co-authored a paper with a group of junior scholars of color on Black liberation theology, James Cone's Black liberation
Hmm.
theology, and writing that from a Christian psychology integrationist perspective. Like that just doesn't exist in the literature, and we need more of that kind of thing,
Right.
So really excited about that. There are talks of maybe doing a special issue on Asian American, psychology and theology. So that might be forthcoming. I'd love to pull you in on that.
Yeah. That would be
My
amazing.
my
Hmm.
colleague at Fuller, Daniel Lee, who's the director of the Center for Asian American, theology,
Hmm.
he just wrote a seminal book on doing Asian American theology. So I think that might be a great way to kind of build off some of the frameworks that he's developed and,
Yeah.
answering the question, well, what does Christian psychology, theology integration look like within an Asian American context? And really excited about doing similar questions with other kind of cultural contexts as well.
Yeah. And you have such great people at Fuller to be able to do something in Asian American psychology, right? So many folks who would be able to contribute to that at Fuller. So I have a few questions that I ask all interviewees. Many of the people who eventually listen to this and watch this will be either graduate students who are thinking about becoming faculty or junior faculty who are starting out in their careers. I'm
Mhm.
curious if you had any advice for those folks in terms of teaching in Christian settings like Fuller or SPU or other, higher ed settings that are explicitly Christian. What kinds of advice might you have for those folks?
Yeah. I think the first piece of advice is to think about your personal and professional values. And the one value I'm thinking of in particular is that, unfortunately, in the world of academia, and unfortunately, this also isn't much different oftentimes in Christian academia, there's often this mindset of, scarcity mindset or this competition mindset where there's not enough resources available for
Yeah.
all of us.
Hmm.
So therefore, we have to kind of fight for ourselves, build a brand, take what we can, and kind of, climb the ladder, on our own and not share our stuff and with other people. And it's a very individualistic,
Right.
in my opinion, kind of self-absorbed, understanding and embodiment of professionalism, And my advice is that, if that doesn't fit your values, like resist that. And early on in your career, my piece of advice is to find colleagues that you can trust who align with your values, who really are willing and, have a track record of living out a professional life that is about the flourishing of all of us together, not just my own,
Hmm.
not just my own self-interest or the self-interest of the groups that I belong in, but really the flourishing of us all. And I think that's a really important way to embody Christianity as well. That progress and success is shared and communal. And just as is the case in graduate school, people have told me it's really more important who you work under, your advisor, and the actual name of the school. So
Right.
sometimes we're very like attracted to like, well, if a school is like one of those R1 schools, like, that's very attractive. And it is,
Hmm.
but people caution me against, well, if you have multiple options and you feel like one may be prestigious, but a little less prestigious, but the person you're working under, you can really trust him and learn under them and they'll invest in you. Almost always that's going to be a better bet. And so relatedly, it's really great to look for mentorship, to look for colleagues and peers that you can run with. And from a purely kind of research, writing and publishing perspective, take a co-authorship strategy. If you can find people you can run with and co-author a bunch of papers with them,
Hmm.
they can bring you in some of their papers, you bring them in some of the papers, and we all publish together. Then it becomes a context for friendship. It's not just like, I want to pad my CV. It's more like, I want to spend more time with my friend Paul. I want to catch up with them. And this is the excuse that brings us together. And, we do happen to benefit from publishing, but it becomes more of a relational endeavor rather than building my kingdom and kind of endeavor. And then taking that approach, I've found it actually is more productive. You actually get more done at the end by taking that relational approach where the goal is friendship and relationship and everyone's success, not just my own.
Yeah.
And we'll actually end up getting farther.
That research is teamwork in a way that counters that hyper-individualistic aspect of our culture. That's really good advice, Dave. And then my final question is, if you could ask my next guest any question about psychology, what would it be? It can be a fun one. It could be a deep one, whatever you would like.
Sure. It may not be super fun. Well, I mean, I find it very interesting. And I actually see myself, Lord willing, in the next 10, 20 years engaged in this question, which is, why is it important for the field of psychology or the field of Christian psychology to become more and more culturally decentered?
That's a really good question.
Just one quick thought related to my question. And when I teach Christian integration or psychology in parts of the world like Africa or Asia, and I teach integration, I'm finding more and more that most of, almost everything that we've learned about Christian integration is actually written in a context and for a context. So it's, North American white male psychology, North American white male theology, integrated in the North American white male way, that it's very theoretical and non-embodied and, lots of stuff. And it's great. It's a great starting point. I learned a lot and I appreciate a lot of it. But when we teach this outside of North America, it becomes very, very clear, that what we actually need in the long run is an Asian theology, Asian psychology integrated in an Asian way, an African psychology and African theology integrated in an African way, and then to bring us all together on equal footing.
Yeah.
For us to have a conversation, dialogue, and learn from each other and go, hey, we all share a common core. We all love and trust, follow Jesus. And we also go about doing this in some unique ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that perhaps in a not too distant time in the future, we can build the foundation, scholarly and people-wise and leaders, so that perhaps in my lifetime, we can have a conversation like that.
And that's going to require people in theology, people in psychology, and people doing that type of integration to all be, in that sense, on the same page, right? And so to your point about community being important and people who are running with you being important, I think that's really important to emphasize here. Wow. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.